The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Using Trauma-Informed Approaches with Women Inmates to Enhance Safety and Security in Jail Settings. My name is Stephen Fogg. I'm with the Center for Effective Public Policy and the National Resource Center on Justice-Involved Women. During today's webinar, we'll discuss trauma and the effects on justice-involved women in correctional settings, techniques and strategies that can be used in correctional settings with women who have experienced trauma, and resources that may be helpful in your work. Before we get started, let's take care of the webinar logistics. We want to be certain that everyone is connected, that you can hear us, or that you have access to technical assistance. Be sure to check your equipment using the links you received in the email about this webinar. There is a control panel to the right of your screen where you can request help or type in comments in the chat box or ask questions. Audio is available through the speakers on your computer or your telephone. Now, phones will be muted throughout the presentation, so we would encourage you to use the chat box on the control panel to the right of your screen to type in your comments. We'll have about 20 to 30 minutes at the end of the presentation for a Q&A. So feel free to type in questions throughout the presentations or hold them until the end. We'll try to accommodate all of your questions in the time we have allotted. Now, we're pleased to have partnered with the American Jail Association for this webinar. The American Jail Association is a national nonprofit organization that supports the professionals who operate our nation's jails. They are the only national association that focuses exclusively on issues specific to operations of local correctional facilities. And I'd like to introduce and turn this over to AJA's president, Ms. Jamie Clayton, for welcoming remarks. Ms. Clayton?
Hi, Stephen. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody, to our partnered webinar. First, I'd like to thank our partners, the Justice Center and the National Resource Center, for allowing us to partner on this webinar. I am the Chief Deputy of Corrections in Imperial County at the Imperial County Sheriff's Office in California, and I also serve, as Stephen said, as the American Jail Association President. So I wanted to take a few minutes just to talk about the things that the American Jail Association offers. We offer support and resources to our nation's jails, and we also have recently started a series of webinars under a PREA grant, offering free informational training seminars to our members. AJA also hosts an annual conference. This year's conference will be in Charlotte in April. AJA also has satellite trainings available to agencies at their request. We also have Certified Jail Manager, Certified Jail Officer, and Certified Correctional Training Certificate programs. We have also partnered with Sam Houston State University and the Correctional Management Institute in Texas to host the National Jail Leadership Command Academy, where we currently have over 700 graduates. We also just announced our Executive Academy that's going to take place starting in April of this year. AJA also works on Capitol Hill on hot topics such as the FCC and PREA. We've also proactively been working on issues affecting jails such as pretrial services and solitary confinement. We are currently partnering with the National Association of Counties, local state sheriff's associations, and the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. Just recently, in October of 2014, the Executive Director, Bob Kasabian, myself, one of the executive board members, and the AJA chaplain were invited to sit and work at the summit on issues involving incarcerated women. And we would like to thank all of the team members and the partnering that occurred at that time for all of their hard work, efforts, and research. As we all know, there are many issues surrounding incarcerated women. From a practitioner standpoint, we also know that most jails are not designed to effectively deal with female offenders, as they are the smaller percentage of the population. Female offenders also have different needs than men when it comes to children, domestic issues, and exposure to years of trauma. They also have unique hurdles to reentry, such as social skills, health issues, and temperament. So again, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Board of Directors and the staff at the American Jail Association for joining us in this webinar. And I'd like to turn you back over to our expert, Stephen.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. So now let me tell you a little bit about the National Resource Center on Justice-Involved Women. It's one of the resource centers created and managed by the Center for Effective Public Policy. We're funded by the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance, in partnership with the National Institute of Corrections. Our primary goal is to provide resources and tools to professionals to equip them to be more successful in their work with justice-involved women. We're happy to be partnered with many wonderful organizations such as Core Associates, Orbis Partners, University of Cincinnati, the Women's Prison Association, the Moss Group, and SAMHSA's National Center on Trauma-Informed Care. We provide on- and off-site training and technical assistance. We have a website dedicated to information dissemination that includes resources related to justice-involved women. We highlight innovative programs. So if you have an innovative program or you know of an innovative program, we'd like to hear about it. We'd like to profile it. And we also keep the field informed through our e-newsletters. If you are interested in learning more about what the Resource Center does and keeping abreast of those issues that we write on, let us know. We'd like to add you to our email list. We also produce briefs, policy papers, and guides on many important topics. And one of the guides we're highlighting today inspired this webinar, Using Trauma-Informed Practices to Enhance Safety and Security in Women's Correctional Facilities, was actually written by today's speaker, and we're pleased to make it available through our website, which will provide that information later today. So what I'd like to do now is find out who you are. Throughout the presentation, we'd like to ask you to participate by responding to a few questions. And here's our first question, which I'm going to launch right now. And I'd like to have you respond, please. So I'd like to get an idea of who's on the webinar today. And I'd like you to choose a category that most closely matches your position or agency. So we're aware that there are some other categories that represent our audience, but these are the top 5 we thought would be most representative. So let's see what you said. We still have the votes coming in, but right now it looks like about 38% of you are prison corrections professionals. About 18% of you are jail corrections professionals. 11% are probation and parole. There are no law enforcement, and about 31% are medical, mental health, or substance abuse treatment or prevention providers. So we have a nice rounded group today, and that's wonderful. I think we're going to speak to issues that may be helpful to all of you. So thank you for participating in this poll. I'm going to close it now. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Alyssa Benedict. She's the founder and executive director of Core Associates, creating opportunities through research and education. She's a skilled trainer and technical assistance provider with expertise in assessment, development, implementation, and evaluation of gender-specific and trauma-informed services and interventions. As I said earlier, one of the briefs that she wrote on behalf of the National Resource Center is one of the reasons that we're here today, and she's authored several other articles and publications regarding gender-responsive and trauma-informed care, and she's collaborated on numerous women offender initiatives. She's a graduate fellow of the University of Connecticut School of Medicine graduate program in public health. And I've personally had the pleasure of working with Ms. Benedict for about 2 years now as a partner to the National Resource Center on Justice-Involved Women. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Alyssa, to get to the heart of the presentation.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm very excited to participate in this webinar on such a deeply important topic in corrections, and I'm also surprised and thrilled that there's such a nice cross-section of participants. So I will do my best to use terms that are relevant to all of you, but I will say that every inch of what I share today is relevant to all aspects of corrections work, be it in institutions or in the community. So I'd like to just begin with an overview of the presentation today. We will be talking about what trauma is and how it impacts the women we work with. And importantly, we'll move into some content around how our interactions with women inmates can really make a difference in our facilities, in our community corrections agencies, and we'll really unpack this notion of trauma-informed practice. It's been a very appropriately so popularized term in the discourse in corrections, and there's a real need to really have some time to understand and explore what trauma-informed practice looks like in our frontline work as we really implement our different roles and responsibilities with female inmates and female probationers and parolees. And we'll move towards the second half of the presentation talking about what are some of the essential practices we can bear in mind in our work with women. And as Stephen mentioned, we'll have a chance to discuss some questions that will come from all of you. So we wanted to begin with another poll that Stephen will moderate and just give you a moment to consider this question. Studies of women offenders in jail show that what percentage have a history of trauma? So if you could take a moment and respond to that, we would appreciate it.
Okay, so we're getting some responses in now, and looks like the majority of folks think that about 53% say that between 60 and 80% have a history of trauma. 37% say that over 90% have a history of trauma. 9% say that there are between 40 and 60% have a history of trauma, and 1% says there is between 20 and 40% of women who have a history of trauma. So it looks like we're heavily choosing the last two choices here, between 60 and 80% and then over 90% there.
Okay, that's
looks like the majority have voted, so I'm going to close this poll.
Thank you, Stephen. So it's always an interesting question to ask because depending on our experiences and exposure to this topic, we may not realize how significant a trauma history is for a lot of the women that we work with. And so the research has showed in both community-based and facility settings that past trauma history is shared by women, over 90% of the women that we work with, which is, of course, extraordinarily high. So it's really one of the most common experiences that the females we work with share. And what we'll be talking about today is some really exciting research in psychology, and there's been a lot of research some of you may have had some exposure to on trauma and the brain, this big topic that's been emerging in the past 3 to 5 years. And what it's really showing us is that the effects of trauma are very significant. They impact a person's behavior in ways that we may not realize. And in the case of our roles in working with women offenders, trauma is often playing a role in her behavior. And it's important to consider that trauma may have played a role and often has played a role in her pathway into the system. And also it may be explanatory factor in some of the behaviors that we see while she's under community supervision or incarcerated, and behaviors that can really complicate our work, that make our jobs fairly difficult because some of these behaviors compromise safety and security. They're about not complying with rules and regulations, etc. So we'll talk about how to manage some of that. But considering trauma is really important, and this national discourse has been very helpful, but what we've seen is there's been an increase in light of our awareness that trauma is very common among women in corrections, where we've seen an increase in the use of trauma-based services and curricula. So there's psychoeducational groups happening and peer support groups happening, which is wonderful, but there's been fewer efforts focused on building trauma-informed cultures and operational practices and interactions in our corrections work settings, be them in facilities or in community corrections. And what we're also realizing from our research and our conversations with staff across the country and with women offenders is that some of the most basic processes in corrections can really function as triggers for females. And so if we're not aware of what those triggers are and able to manage them, there's some pretty negative consequences that can compromise not only women offenders' health and success, but it unnecessarily complicates our work in any area of corrections. So this presentation today is largely about how can we be more effective and reduce the complexities by really being mindful of what trauma is, how it impacts women inmates, and what we can do to create basic safety and stability in our work environments. And what we're finding is that the safety and security makes a huge difference. So in facilities and community corrections agencies that are beginning to really intentionally implement trauma-informed practices in their corrections environments, they're finding that inmate stability is increased, there's reductions in critical incidents. They can, as practitioners, de-escalate situations more frequently and more effectively. They're finding that there's fewer restraints, fewer need for seclusion and other measures. Engagement in services is actually built, so instead of some of the resistance, we see a lot more motivation to actually participate in programs, and some of the community activities that we know women really benefit from. And as we all love, this last one is a hugely important one. We need safe, secure, productive corrections environments. I mean, that's a wish that we all have. So we all play a role in this, and so we'll continue to talk for the next several minutes about, you know, what can our understanding do in terms of helping us transform our work environment and be more effective. So in talking about what trauma is, it's really helpful to talk about what a traumatic event is separately from what the actual experience of trauma is. We do know that it's caused by a very stressful, often life-threatening experience that's outside the range of what we would call usual. And the symptoms that result from that experience, many of us have dealt with in our frontline work with women offenders. These symptoms, these various behaviors and reactions are not always conscious and are actually linked to a very brain-based response to having been exposed to trauma. And I'm going to provide you with a kind of a brain science 101 to help us really understand what's really going on in the wake of trauma. And what we find when we expose practitioners to this really new research on how trauma impacts the brain and the body, they find there's light goes on, and there's an ability to really see women's behaviors differently and to craft much more effective interactions. I wanted to highlight that, and we'll talk about a little bit, some examples of what would constitute a traumatic event, but I also wanted to just make the point that trauma is often not something that happens at one point in time. So if a woman has experienced sexual abuse, what we find in the research is that there's often multiple traumas that are experienced versus just one episode of sexual abuse. There's sometimes a manipulation phase on the part of the perpetrator. There's the actual instances of abuse, and then the aftermath can also be experienced with additional traumas. For instance, if she disclosed to her mother how her mother reacted could be cause additional trauma or not. So it's really important to look at trauma as not a single event, but rather a holistic experience that often proceeds for years with women offenders. And this slide is more of an example of what traumatic events might be, and this is certainly not exhaustive, but the point with this is to really acknowledge that there's a lot that can be considered traumatic, and the research in trauma and on trauma is showing that there are several situations in the lives of human beings that are experienced as traumatic. These are just some of them. There are certainly more. And so I wanted to give you all a chance to respond to another poll question, and it is witnessing trauma as traumatic? Does it have as much of an impact as the direct experience of trauma? So if you could take a moment, Stephen will get the poll question for you to respond to.
Okay, so it looks like the majority of you believe yes, witnessing trauma as traumatic is as traumatic as experiencing trauma. Sorry, I didn't say that correctly. 92% of you marked yes to is witnessing trauma as traumatic as experiencing trauma, and about 8% indicate no.
Okay. Yeah, so the majority is correct that the witnessing of trauma can be as have as much of an impact as the direct experience of it. And again, when you reconsider the list that I had up earlier, which I can scroll back to, so if you witness domestic violence, if you witness accidents, if you witness partner battery, the destruction of one's home or community, all of these things, the witnessing of them is as impactful as the direct experience of them. And then when you take this into a corrections environment, whether it be a woman offender who is in a waiting room with other women and or men, or a woman in a facility, and if you just call to mind as I talk right now the range of experiences and events she might see, even in her first 12 hours, for instance, in a jail, the witnessing of those events, of a new person coming in for an intake, or someone being transitioned to court, someone getting news about a loved one, someone not having a loved one show up for a visit. All of these things compound the trauma she's already experienced in her own life when she witnesses other people in distress. So again, it's what we'll talk about later is, well, then how do we create and manage these environments so that there's not so much distress present? Because when the distress is present, she finds a way to cope. And the way she often finds a way to cope is doing things that are either rule violations or counterproductive for her and for us. So we'll talk about some of those practicalities. The, okay, well, what now? You know, now that we know these things can be distressing. So related to this, the literature has shown, and there's been so many fabulous studies, again, many drawing from the experiences of professionals in the field and from women offenders themselves, studies that are really classifying, you know, what's particularly traumatic for women. And it's important to understand their unique experiences and pathways. And we know that before women enter the system, there's a lot going on in their lives that could constitute trauma, including lack of access to needed physical and mental health services, struggling with addiction, ongoing abuse from a domestic partner, separation from children, lack of employment, et cetera. A lot of the things that were covered at the jail summit that stimulated this webinar can be really traumatic for women. And after, once she is involved, for instance, in a facility, the additional trauma she may experience often relate to separation from children and loved ones, disconnection from relationships that she's defined as supportive, pregnancy and childbirth while in the system, interactions with male staff, and I have that bracketed because it really it depends on her history if she may have particular comfort or discomfort with male or female staff. And I'm sure if we had a whole retreat together today, you all would have several anecdotes about how you've been received by female offenders. Just walking into a room, if as a male or a female you look like someone who has violated her, automatically you can be a trigger before you even speak to her. So there's a way for us to account for these triggers in a thoughtful manner. Feeling isolated or misunderstood, and maybe having to participate in programs that are not gender responsive, competent culturally or trauma informed. There's a lot of curricula circulating in corrections, some of which is really well grounded in the literature on women and some that is not. And that's true for curricula and programs that are present in facilities, but also those that are available in the community. So I've worked with probation officers where they have women on their caseload that aren't showing up to services, and when we take the time to look at what the services are that she's been mandated to attend, the quality isn't there. And often includes some really scary things like having to disclose past abuse, being mandated to do that, and then she doesn't show up to the group again, and then she gets violated. So there's been some really holistic exploration of what's available in our facility and in the community that's not going to trigger women, but instead provide some more support. So why is trauma so destructive? It's very violating in a very physical way, an emotional way, depending on the particular trauma she may have experienced. But there are these three things around trust, control, and safety that are really compromised. She learns that the world is not a trustworthy place. She feels out of control and feels very unsafe. So trauma really destroys these essential elements of our humanity, the ability to trust, feel, and have a healthy control of ourselves and our space, and have some basic emotional safety. So that's why it's so destructive. And what I found is a lot of, I've mentioned earlier, there's this discourse on trauma and corrections, but the how-to is what I get really excited about. Okay, well, what does it mean? We can talk about she feels depressed, women may feel anxious, they may be engaging in self-injurious behaviors, they may become suicidal. We know there's a lot circulating about the psychological impact of trauma, but the cutting-edge research I mentioned in my introduction on trauma in the brain, I think is what's going to transform corrections and help us move into really productive, exciting places of practice as corrections professionals. And so I capture this body of research with the term neurophysiology, fancy way of really talking about how trauma impacts the brain-body, neuro being brain, physiology being body. So if you all can stay with me on maybe a 5-minute journey now of the nervous system, I think you'll find at the end of the 5 minutes you'll have some new insights about the women that you work with and maybe even yourselves, because working in corrections, it's one of the environments that's extremely challenging. I think it's deeply honorable work for those of us that have worked in corrections, and it can be very stressful for us as well. And we could do a whole webinar on that. But for now, let's just talk about the nervous system and what happens when we've been exposed to trauma. And this quote kind of captures it, and I'll in the next 5 minutes really describe what this means. Peter Levine, who's an expert internationally in trauma and healing, talks about how we all have these healthy nervous systems when we're born, and then typically when we're confronted with something like a stressor, things kind of get out of balance for a bit, but then it settles, and we, having been exposed to the stressor and deal with it effectively, we actually have stronger nervous systems as a result of exposure to kind of day-to-day stresses. They build a capacity for us to roll with different things in our lives. However, when that system has been disorganized by trauma, that ability to roll and adapt is really compromised. And so that's what we'll talk about in the next 5 minutes. We have this human stress response that evolution equipped us all with, an ability to react. And we all know what it's like when our heart rate goes up, when we get nervous, or when we're, I don't know, some of us with we've gotten a lot of snow in the Northeast, so people are walking really carefully. And so there's this way that we get our bodies to respond to stress. And then there's this thing called the trauma-influenced stress response, which is very, very different. And that I would say most of, if 90% or more of women have a trauma history, I'd say 90% or more of staff are. That means really working with the effects of this day to day with women. You're witnessing this. You may just not have had an opportunity to really understand, gee, what is this behavior about when she refuses to do a basic intake with me, or when she's sitting in group and completely disengaged. We often have lots of fancy terms to describe those behaviors, but a lot of them boil down to a basic survival response, which I'll talk about. So let's talk about the nervous system. So we have, there are these two main parts of what is called our control center, which is the autonomic nervous system. We don't need to get bogged down in terminology. All we need to know is that the ANS basically controls a lot of body functions unconsciously. So right now my heart is beating and I don't have to tell it to beat. I'm breathing because my ANS is doing it all for me. It's just taking care of all of those things, my digestion, etc. And then it has two main parts. One is the SNS, the sympathetic nervous system, and that part of the nervous system is the thing that helps us mobilize to react. So someone crosses in front of your car, you jam on the brakes, that's your SNS. It helps you mobilize really quickly. And the PNS is the parasympathetic nervous system, and that's the part that helps us calm down after we've been exposed to a stressor. So there's this beautifully designed system that allows us to be really effective and take action, but also relax and what they call rest and digest, where after mobilization we kind of get to chill out and calm down, and our bodies can regroup. That's the key. Our bodies have time to regroup and get out of that stress mode. And some of the things to be aware of around mobilization is, and if we again were together in person for several hours, we might share about, oh gee, here's what stresses me out and here's what happens in my body when I'm stressed. Typically our heart rate goes up, our breathing gets more quick, our muscles tighten, and when we are confronted with a stressor, especially a serious one, things like digestion shut down because the body knows I need to prioritize mobilization, not digestion. So the relaxation response is really important because it allows things to come back online, like a more even heart rate, deeper breathing, digestion comes back online, and our bodies can regroup from the stressor. So our peak performance is when, and I have this car analogy where you can think of the mobilization response as the gas pedal that helps us go, and then the relaxation response is the brake that helps us kind of slow down. And so this curve on the right side of the PowerPoint shows we have this charge and then release, charge and release. And peak performance is when both systems are working together in tandem. So an example I like to give is if we're on a hike together instead of on a webinar and we see 20 feet in front of us this really windy looking object, what's going to happen is we are going to feel our bodies react. We're going to feel like, oh, what could that be? Is it a snake? Is it not a snake? And so the key in a normal, in the human response to stress that hasn't been affected by trauma, we can look at something that looks scary or potentially scary, like this stick, and we have access to parts of the brain that are going to help us analyze it. Like, okay, maybe it's a stick. Let me take some time with this. Let me move a little closer. We have a chance to decide, maybe I should go back. Maybe I shouldn't even go near this. I'm not sure. But there's a lot of thinking that can happen with a typical stress response. You can make choices and decisions, and you have access to that. And then you can relax. When we've had traumatic experiences, so imagine the women that we've worked with, they've been often so severe, they've involved such intense fear, helplessness, or horror, and that's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Psychological Disorders talks about. I really like that definition because there's a degree of helplessness. Often what happens is she's unable to evade the threat, and so she's in this fight mode, and there's so much mobilization. That gas pedal has to, for her to survive, has to be so mobilized that the stress reaction takes over to keep her safe, and she really never gets a chance to return to rest and digest. There's not that relaxation response. There's a vigilance. And the reason for this is often there was no resolution. So if you think of a woman who has been raped and she still lives with her perpetrator or nearby to her perpetrator, there's never really an opportunity for her to relax. Or if it was multiple rapes, her system, to help her survive that, to even be able to move through life, has to be on high alert all the time. Being high alert all the time takes a dramatic toll on our bodies and our psyches. It would be like if you imagine what it's like to have your muscles tighten when the example I gave of driving your car and someone cuts in front of you, maybe a small child, and your muscles really tighten up. And imagine how good it feels when you relax and you breathe and you call your partner and you say, gosh, this was such a close call, I was so scared. For a lot of women with these trauma histories, there's not that release. There's not that ability to integrate what has happened because the vigilance for her own safety needs to be continually present. And so on top of this, and I think you'll find this very important, there are two pathways to fear, and it's the low road and the high road. And I already described with my prior example, the high road is the one where when we see something that's threatening, we are able to think about a plan of action. So we feel our stress response, but that parts of the brain, the rational thinking brain, is really allowed to do its thing and help us get out of a stressful situation. The low road is different. It bypasses the thinking brain, and here's why we need it. So if you take a minute and look at this picture, nature also designed a way for us to respond in a way that will keep us safe. And the key to this low road response is that it does not involve rational thinking. So if this guy in this photo had seen this threat and thought, gee, let me sit here for a few minutes and explore my options, he would be killed. So the nature has designed it so that we can instantaneously react to something without thinking in order to keep ourselves safe. And this is a really, really critical stress response to understand. It's nature designed it. We all have the capacity to instantly react without thinking. But for the women we work with, this type of stress response often dominates. So I can't underscore that enough, that this low road, this unconscious, instantaneous reaction is something that's typically operating with a lot of the women we work with. So when we're thinking, why is she acting this way? She's refusing to engage, or she's aggressing with another inmate. We think there's a lot more thought happening behind those behaviors than actually is the case. The reality is a lot of these behaviors that complicate our work with women are happening quite unconsciously. She's in a survival stress response that her body has designed to keep her safe. And she's probably had a lot of practice with it given her experiences outside of the system. So everything is a snake in the sand for a lot of the women that we work with. There's such a high activation, there's automatic stress reactions, etc. There's not a resetting like I talked about. And so this is really relevant to our work, right? If we're saying, okay, a lot of women have had significant trauma, it's upwards of 90%, and now we're learning that the reactions or the effects of that trauma create a situation in which her body is constantly mobilized to deal with threat, and that she could be set off pretty quickly into that survival mode. Things like smells, sounds, specific sights, specific words can be very triggering. They can actually trigger some of the women we work with into the exact state. I don't even want to say state of mind, because it's not that the thinking parts of the brain aren't engaged. Her body will go into the very same physiological state it was in at the time of the trauma. So she may be telling us, for instance, during an intake, I'm not going to say anything to you, it's none of your business, and start to really get combative with us. And there's typically a survival instinct kicking in for her in that moment. I'll give an example of rape. So this, if you look, this is a part of this graph should be familiar. So the one I presented earlier showed this kind of nice curve of activation and rest, activation and rest. So rape is an example of one type of trauma that completely disrupts that even up and down, up and down. And so researchers and trauma experts talk about some of the women that we work with are either stuck on high, they're super vigilant around their environment, they're constantly scanning for threat, or they're stuck on low. These are the women that are very disengaged, probably not engaging verbally that much. They look very withdrawn. If you're in a prison or a jail, it's the woman that's sitting in the corner kind of slumped, not saying much. Women who are just stuck in this really under-arousal. She's completely detached from her environment because to be in it is almost overwhelming for her. And so when we talk about an example of rapes, if there's anything in a jail, for instance, that is a reminder of her rape, and it could be as simple as hearing a door slam, or we know that nighttime routines are very difficult for trauma survivors. Hygiene can be a very difficult time for trauma survivors, especially if the trauma has included assault to the body, sexual assault, or physical assault to the body. So now body care is a trigger. And so what happens is that the neurons that helped her mobilize to survive the trauma years, weeks, months ago actually mobilize in that moment when she's working with us. So this I find when I'm working with staff is this huge eye-opener of, oh my gosh, now I know I'm seeing these behaviors much differently. It has largely nothing to do with us in the sense that she smells or sees or hears something and boom, the heart rate goes up, the digestion stops, the muscles tighten, the eyes widen. So these neurochemicals are the same ones that were triggered during the event, and the reactions are not conscious or hysterical. They're really expected. It's what evolution designed to keep us safe. The problem is she's stuck in that mode. So there's ways that we can, and what we'll be moving into in a minute or so, there are ways that we can respond as corrections professionals to create an environment more intentionally that helps her feel safe and not so inclined to get triggered into survival mode. There's ways we can talk, there's terms we can use, there's ways we can physically arrange the space to create more calm, or what we talk about in the trauma research, they call it regulation. Regulation is another word for calm. So how can we help her to feel calm and regulated and stable so that she doesn't get triggered so much? It's in that calm and stability is where all the work happens, right? Her engagement in services, her motivation to get connected to a community resource that you might be offering to her. That rest and digest, if that's not present, that means she's only present to the vigilance and the fear, and there's no treatment that can happen in that space. And that's where we see recidivism. So these are expected, and I don't have the PowerPoint included on this, but I did want to mention for some of you this may be relevant, especially if some of you are involved in any investigations. What we find is that, and the research is crystal clear on this, and it's actually changing the way law enforcement will investigate alleged rapes, sexual assault, etc. Is the parts of the brain that really retain typical memories of events and what time it happened and who was there are shut off during that traumatic experience, like I mentioned earlier. So she may not have a chronological memory of certain events in her life, and when we're doing an assessment, for instance, a risk need assessment, we can assume she's lying if she says during week 1 that something happened, she started using between ages 15 and 16, and maybe week 2 she says it's 18, and we often think, oh, if that's inconsistent, she's lying. Well, often in a traumatic space, we don't have a chronological memory. We remember more sensations and sounds. So it's very interesting about how this literature is transforming so many aspects of corrections. So if we look at the women that we work with, so here's the sequence of things. There's a traumatic experience. There's overwhelm in her neurophysiology. It goes untreated. She doesn't have a space to really regain a sense of stability, so she's in this vigilant stress response mode. And the cues that are common in corrections tend to trigger that traumatic memory, and she reacts from that state of fear. And this is where we could probably spend a whole hour listing off the behaviors that complicate our work with women. It could be refusals, noncompliance, self-sabotage, manipulation. A lot of these, if you really unpack them in interviews with staff and women about what happens around these behaviors, they're often related to her doing the best she can to survive this experience of trauma memory she's having. So this notion of survival is something I hope you leave with potentially a reframe that the way she's trying to survive is not necessarily going to be adaptive, right? You know, we know that substance abuse can be linked to wanting to numb the pain from traumatic experiences. So we can acknowledge that that's a survival strategy, but still be motivated to help her adopt new ways of surviving and new ways of being that can help her feel calm without the substance or without the aggression or without the manipulation. We can actually achieve that. But to reframe it for ourselves and for her as survival is really important. She's doing her best, however imperfectly, to try to feel safe. So what we can be doing in our environments is to give her new options and to create environments that don't trigger as many fears. And I think that's particularly hard in corrections because there's a lot that we have to do as part of our day-to-day work that can't change anytime soon. We have to do intakes. We have to use handcuffs. We have to do searches of someone's person to make sure that there's safety. I mean, there are these things that we call operational practices that are absolutely essential, but we can actually move through them differently so that she is less triggered along the way. And I want to talk a little bit about that now as we move into the what next piece. So I want to just give an example of some behaviors and now begin to consider them in this larger trauma context. So on the right here, the behaviors, we might see a woman during group say, you know, she's in the middle of perhaps a conversation with the facilitator, says, this is stupid, I'm leaving. And that can be really unnerving for us, you know, let's be honest. We sometimes work really hard to do our jobs well, and then we get interrupted with some of these behaviors that are really challenging. And what we're realizing with trauma is that that statement could be fueled by a feeling of fear that she may not even be conscious of. So what's happening when we have extensive interviews with women and staff, we find out things like the door was open next to the group room and she saw that it was open and it's never been open before, and it triggered a fear of who's in that room and am I safe. Another example might be during a risk assessment she refuses to give any information, and it may be that, again, she's fearing that she might not have privacy and confidentiality, especially if she's heard some conversations between COs and their colleagues about other inmates. She may just assume, well, they were talking about another inmate and they're probably going to talk about me, has a felt sense of fear and lack of trust and safety, and then it propels this defiant, resistant behavior. Other examples are on refusal of drug tests. And as staff react and say, you have to do this or else, she escalates and becomes aggressive. And so this notion of you have to do something because I told you to can very much trigger feelings of lack of control in one's environment. And so the reality is we have to drug test. So what I'll be sharing in a few minutes is how might we talk about that differently to create some safety in that space with her so that she's more likely to engage in this very necessary practice of drug testing. And often some of the refusals have zero to do with the task at hand. I've worked with women that had nothing to do with the drug test and everything to do with a really bad visit with her daughter. And now she feels out of control and unglued, and she's got to do a urine. And I've also heard from staff and women that when women are in this stress mode, remember I told you that certain parts of the body are not as accessible, be it digestion and even elimination, like urination is much harder for her. And so sometimes women are so afraid. So imagine if she has to literally pull her pants down to provide a urine, and if she has a sexual assault history, that can be a big trigger. Now she is having a difficult time physically urinating and is getting, staff are having a really agitated response to that. And so there's a whole way to go through that process differently and still get the urine that we need as part of our jobs. So to summarize this as we move into more of the how-to, trauma, it absolutely lives in the body. It's not just psychological. So these psychological effects that we've all seen probably in different articles and talked about in different trauma trainings, my goal with working with corrections folks is to get beyond this. Just this knowledge is important, but to get beyond it and look at more of the physiology, the felt sense of dysregulation, agitation, inability to really access parts of the thinking brain when she's triggered, and how we can create a space where she actually can engage in the services we're providing, be motivated to take charge of aspects of her life that she needs to take charge of. And so what's going to mediate all this simply is us. The research is showing that social responses and support is one of the biggest predictors of engagement in services among women and men in corrections, frankly. So this ability to attend to her experience while still holding her accountable is this beautiful, delicate balance we can strike in corrections. It's not an abuse excuse, and it's not a suggestion that because of trauma, now we can't hold her accountable to some of the things that require accountability. It's about holding her accountable in a way that's more trauma-informed, so that it's a very integrated way of doing this work. I get concerned at the thought that we would not hold women accountable because of trauma. It's this integrated way of having the accountability process unfold and sound different. So what we can do is SAMHSA and others talk about this notion of universal precautions, which is basically assume all of the females you work with have had trauma, because so many have, and even those where we can't find it in their file maybe haven't felt safe enough to disclose. So if we assume, and this is being promoted in all sectors, not just corrections, in medicine, in education, community-based mental health, they're saying assume it's present and act accordingly, which means we're going to be trauma-informed at the individual level when we're interpersonally working with women. We're going to, at the facility and system levels, literally create policies and practices that create more stability and less trigger. And then we're going to do our best to, in any of these contexts, reduce distress and facilitate this sense of regulation, which I previously defined as a sense of safety and stability, in her, literally in her body, and a felt sense that I am okay in this space right now, instead of a felt sense of immediate fear and danger because sounds and comments and smells and sights have brought her back to that place of extreme helplessness. So in the trauma brief, I'll just mention this briefly because you can read it in the document itself, but we talk about 8 steps towards becoming trauma-informed, and I'm going to expand upon a few of these that I feel are probably the most practical in terms of answering what next, what can I do after I get off this webinar tomorrow or today that's going to be more trauma-informed. But the 8 steps are around a commitment to trauma-informed practice, supporting and training staff using webinars like this and other opportunities to really unpack what it means to be trauma-informed. I get, what's the word, it kind of fired up a little when I hear people saying, well, it's about creating safety, and Emotional support, well, let's talk about what that sounds like. What does it actually sound like to create safety? What does it look like at 11 at night when she's banging on her cell door? How are we trauma-informed then? I think sometimes our examples are examples of how to be trauma-informed around what groups to have available and giving her options to choose, and all of those are so important. But the rubber meets the road with some of these really either scary or really non-productive behaviors, and it's at those moments that being trauma-informed becomes the most important to the person who's struggling, let's say a woman refusing hygiene, but also to the 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 pairs of eyes watching you interact with her. So it's like everything we do affects the in-the-moment success with this person, this woman in front of us, but everybody else will feel safe or not based on what they see us doing. So this trauma-informed language and communications we talk about in the brief, what are some of the terms we could use that create stability and safety? There's lots of corrections jargon that I encourage folks to consider. Use what you have to, but if there's an opportunity without compromising safety to change terms, like a cell shakedown, that can be really triggering of a phrase versus cell search. I was in a state recently, they talked about that they had to lug women, this notion of lugging her. And women hear that, and even the language we use creates a felt sense of safety or not. So can we have professional, clear terms that create operational stability as staff but aren't triggering women? And I actually think when I work with and do TA with programs and facilities, they're pretty creative at coming up with alternatives, and they are stunned at the impact such a small change can have on the culture of their facility or their probation or parole office. So the physical space piece, number 4, is really about having the environment have enough kind of life in it, again, without compromising safety and security or without compromising boundaries, but physically how you structure the space and the furniture in it, for instance, can that cue to trauma. So for instance, when I have done assessments with women, I often will not sit behind a desk. So if safety and security policies permit that you sit in a different location in your office during that versus behind a desk, which conveys kind of a power authority differential, that can make a difference. So if you're able to keep the door open and not have your chair near the door, but rather her chair near the door for a sense of not feeling trapped, things like that. I often would, even if when I was working in programs where we were expected to sit behind a desk, I would have 2 chairs, and always when she came in, ask her what her preference is. I would build in choice. I didn't need the extra chair in my office, but to be able to say to her, where would you like to sit right now, given that she has to move through an assessment for the next hour with me, automatically put her at a level of ease that might not be present if she's told to sit down. So little things like that go a long way. And then there's an opportunity with this trauma-informed movement in corrections to really revise existing procedures to be more regulating for women and implement new ones where we can, right, to be creative about what could we introduce on top of what we're already doing to really try to create some sense of safety and stability. It might be as a PO or a parole officer, you have a way of launching your meetings, your supervisions with her that's not diving right into how are you doing with your conditions, but rather maybe a more, hey, how was your week going? Tell me what went well. And to start some of these processes differently and in a more positive, reinforcing way, and to implement strategies that help women manage difficult symptoms. So that's a whole other topic, but we do talk about that a bit in the brief, as well as building a kind of an environment, be it a community corrections environment or a facility environment that's trauma-informed. So the principles of trauma-informed care that have been promoted are safety, trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And when I look at these terms, and I would be so curious about your reactions, but when you look at these are really hard to bring to life in corrections, right? Because we have a responsibility to ensure safety, security in a very strict operational sense. And for those of us doing work in the community, we're really making sure we're prioritizing community safety as well. So what I would like to suggest is that there's a way to fulfill our role as ensurers of safety and security and stewards of protocols that are necessary in corrections, but to really find creative ways to bring these principles to life as we do that. Instead of, sometimes I can provide a collaborative environment. I can communicate with her more collaboratively, but other times I can't. In most cases, we can be collaborative. So some of the contact points give us an opportunity to really think about, okay, on the left we have these principles. How can, in these different institutional processes, can we do a better job of bringing these to life, of making choice a part of treatment, making choice, for instance, a part of the intake admissions process in very small ways, like I said earlier, with offering a choice of where to sit, offering a tissue. There are very simple ways to do this, and then more involved ones where facilities have done wholesale changes in their policies and practices to bring these 5 principles to life. I encourage you to look at what Massachusetts DOC, the Framingham Women's Facility, has done quite a bit around trauma-informed care. They may even be on this call. There's really exciting examples we've been highlighting on the Resource Center website around what we can be doing that's still allowing us to fulfill our role as corrections professionals, but to do some different, very creative things that create regulation. So in the community, here are some contact point examples. So just these 2 PowerPoints, you could go back and have staff meetings and say, let's pick 2 and try to really infuse them with intentional trauma-informed care. So I wanted to do another poll and just give you a chance to answer this question of which of the practices, risk assessment, intake, a routine court appearance, or attending a trauma group. In your opinion, which of these can be particularly traumatic when experienced by women survivors of trauma?
Okay, I've opened the poll. We have a few answers coming in now. Looks like we have a few responses for each of the options. About 8%, no, that's changing, sorry. So about 15% of you believe that completing a risk need assessment with a PO, 57% believe completing an intake process at a jail, 3% a routine court appearance, and 24% attending a trauma support group.
Okay, good. That's very helpful. I like to ask this question because what we found in our communications and research with staff and with female offenders is that it is largely dependent on her prior experiences what she will find particularly traumatic. So you can work with a woman who is absolutely fine with a court appearance but is really triggered at even the thought or suggestion of attending a trauma support group. Or you could find a woman who finds the intake process, despite a lot of the things that we know can be triggering as part of a routine intake, okay and manageable, but delving into some of the content that's required for a risk need assessment is really triggering. So the key to this is, so it's kind of a trick question in the sense that we actually don't know. It completely depends on her and her unique range of experiences. And there's a lot of if we had more time, we would talk about her cultural, spiritual, gender. There are all these identities that intersect to also mix in with traumatic experiences and how she perceives them and reacts to them. So the other thing to bear in mind is you could be working with a woman for 6 months and have accompanied her to 3 or 4 court appearances, and then on the 5th one is when there's a trigger. And that could be about who was in the room, terms that were used, new decisions made. So we have to be, this universal precautions concept is about being aware in the present moment of her lived experience and not necessarily expecting patterns to be the same, even if you've worked with her for a long time, and to certainly not make assumptions based on what we would find traumatizing. It's really important to honor her unique life experiences, and there's several things we might not know about those, and it really defines what she would consider to be traumatic. So one of the things we suggest in the Resource Center is really making routine practices more trauma-informed. And these 3 questions are ones you can bring back to your unique work environments to really think about how does a procedure A function as a trigger, how could it be implemented differently? And is there something new that we can do? So I like to always share an example of what some of the key elements are of a trauma-informed procedure. These key elements can be used in virtually every procedure that we have to do as part of our jobs in corrections, be it intake, risk assessment, supervision session, home visit. There's and certainly the ones that involve more of an invasion of personal space for her. It becomes really important to use elements of this procedure. But I just wanted to walk through this quickly. It's really important regardless of what we're doing, and it could be even transitioning from one part of the facility to another, or helping her to get prepared for a medical visit, to tell her what's going to take place and why. And this can be just a couple of sentences. It doesn't have to be a dissertation, but just to pause and say, this is what's happening and why. And it's even, I think, even more empowering to say, here's what's going to happen. What's your understanding of why we're doing this? To empower her to talk to us about it. And then to describe what it's going to entail. What are the main things that are going to happen as part of, for instance, this intake? And where you can offer choice, and I'm not in your facility, so it's really up to you all to talk about, okay, here's where we have some elbow room and some wiggle room around giving options. You may not be able to give any options with some of your procedures, and it's okay to say, it may be hard for you to, because there's really no choice in how we have to do this, but I really appreciate you doing it. That automatically can help put her at ease. So this reassurance that you're going to do the best you can to maximize her safety and comfort. And I would encourage you to refrain from telling her, I think sometimes we say things like, this is as uncomfortable for me as it is for you. And I would encourage us to not say those things because it makes her feel even more uneasy. Now she feels like we're so uncomfortable and we actually, despite how she might be behaving, she's relying on us to maintain some safety and stability. So if we seem really freaked out or uncomfortable, it's going to make her feel less safe. So to reassure her that we are confident in what we're doing and that we're going to do our best to maintain her safety and comfort. If you have time, ask if she has any questions, and then actually say we're going to begin now. I really encourage that instead of just beginning, because often by the time you're ready to start, she actually may already be triggered. Even despite a really trauma-informed, thoughtful communication process, the anticipation of having removing her clothes or remove items from her purse or whatever it may be, we actually may have already lost her to a trauma reaction. So to bring her back with, are you ready, and make some eye contact can actually help her get back into the present and out of her fear response. And then we can use verbal cues along the way. Now I'm going to place items onto the table. Now you're going to feel my hand here. I'm going to move these papers to this desk, so I want you to notice that's the sound you're going to hear. All of those things actually keep her rooted in the present moment and not into a fear response. And you might, if you begin to pay real close attention, you'll actually see cues in how she's physically using her body, how she's sitting, if she's in a fear response or not. You'll see tension or not. So then when you're done, you can let her know the procedure has been completed and ask her how she's doing. And so it could be, you know, we were able to do that really well without any problems. I really appreciate it. How are you doing? Thanks so much. And then you let her know what's next. If you are listening to me right now and saying, yeah, right, there's no way I have time to do this, then pick a couple. You could pick the invitation, does she have any question? You could maybe take from this list, I'm going to really start to make it clear that I'm actually starting the belongings search. Or for, let's say you're doing some cell searches, you could say, you know, so here's what's going to happen. I've had staff say, you know, we have to do these cell searches unannounced for safety reasons. Absolutely. But the moment at which you have had the women stand outside their doors and now you're going to enter their room, she obviously knows that you're going to enter her room. So at that point, to even take a moment to say, we're doing this for everyone's safety and security, and we really appreciate your cooperation. It takes probably 7 seconds. My almost guarantee to you in every case is you're going to be helping the majority of the women actually access some stability and move away from a fear response. Just by having someone in an authority position say, we appreciate it, and this is to keep you safe, not to make you feel horrible. It's just something that we have to do to maintain safety and security. Thank you so much. It takes a short amount of time. It goes an absolutely long way. And when I interview women after these types of procedures have been tweaked, the response is it's compelling to hear what a difference it makes for them. And then what we find is later on that shift, there's less problems. There's less disputes between women. There's less resistance to staff directives. There's more general calm. And again, we see the same thing on the community side. Those of you who may or may not be familiar with the Women Offender Case Management Model as a trauma-informed approach to probation and parole, and the results are really amazing that we're seeing just by adding some of this trauma-informed, gender-responsive approach, we're seeing reduced recidivism. And so that's an example of some of the elements. And then I also wanted to make sure I included before we end what I consider to be essential skills that you can use interpersonally when communicating with a woman one-on-one. And certainly you could use these skills when you're communicating with a large group of women at once. So this micro pause I have in the PowerPoint is this notion of, let's say she says, I'm not going to group. I'm absolutely not going to group. We often don't have time to sit and really think, gee, what could this be about? We often don't have that luxury, right? Which is why trainings like this are really helpful in having kind of a Rolodex of what could be going on with her. She doesn't like the group. She misses her kids. There's this whole range of things that are common among women. But a micro pause where we kind of get out of our own reactivity, right, and say, okay, I'm going to really take a quick breath here and try to respond in a way that's going to create some regulation, even though I'm really offended by what she says. Some of the things are really offensive, right? When I've been yelled and screamed at, and this micro pause is really hard. So if we can pause for a minute, collect ourselves, and then validate, reflectively listen, and collaboratively problem solve. So what it might look like is, she refuses to go to group. We might say, I understand it can be really hard to go to a group, especially, I don't know, maybe you don't enjoy it, maybe you don't feel like going. That must be really hard to do something you don't want to do. That immediately, and when the brain research on this shows, they literally hook people up and look at how their bodies and what's firing in the brain when people speak in this way to them, and literally the centers that create calm and regulation are firing. The heart rate goes down, the breathing goes down, cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone, goes down. So all this research is there around just a basic statement of validation helps her calm versus you have to go or else. That may be true. If there's time for us to not start with that and say, I know this is hard. If we have time to hear what her concerns are, great. She might say it's boring and say, so it sounds like you don't enjoy the group. That must be difficult to sit there. The last piece of collaborative problem solving is that's where you represent the rules and the regs. You know, if this is a requirement, it's going to be really important for you to go. I know it's difficult, and I'd really appreciate if you give it a try, and maybe we can talk more later about a different group if that's an option, or if there are options, you can present them. But it's this three-step process of, and this must be hard. I'm sensing that you're not wanting to do this. I get it. If she's given you content and you have time for content, you can reflect what you hear her saying. It may be that she can't stand the other women in the group. It may be that some of the inmates use it as a forum to gush about things that are very triggering for her. She's not aware of that. She just knows she hates sitting there. So it's going to come out as, I don't want to go to this. This is stupid. So to say, it sounds like the other women are upsetting to you. So how can we help you get to group today so that you don't get another infraction? Or why don't you go to group and we can carve out time to really talk about this later, how you can manage being in the group more successfully. Again, the cool thing about this is that there are short versions and long versions depending on the time that you have. It may be that all you have time is for, I know this is really hard for you, and I would really appreciate it if you could go in group right now so that we can maybe chat later. If you have time to do all three, great. And this is something you can also do at the group or population level. So let's say it was a really tough night in the jail, lots of banging on the cell doors, lots of lack of compliance. So to be able to say on the next shift, I understand it's really hard, ladies, to be here. It might be really hard for some of you. Some of you may be missing family, missing jobs, missing lots of things on the outside. We understand that. We're going to do the best we can to create some safety while you're here so that we can get some things done that need to get done. That's a lot more effective than, you guys are really loud last night, you need to learn to shut up. all that does is stimulate a stress response. So there's a way to say we can't have banging on the doors, but we get that there's a lot of concerns that you're carrying while you're here. We get it. We're going to do our best to understand it, but we cannot have banging on the doors. So we do trainings where we actually role play a lot of this out. And again, when staff go back and implement it, they're pretty amazed at some of the impacts from small statements that they insert when working with large groups of women, or one-on-one during parole, or when you're in the community area during downtime and she's complaining about something or concerned, and you can use these essential skills to really move through those interactions differently. And so to wrap up what we really want to pay attention to, that I just talked about some examples of interpersonally how you can work, how you can talk differently in that way. And then we want to think in terms of our office space, in our agencies, in our facilities, how are we creating an environment that actively cues stability? Again, the furniture, sounds, a lot of facilities are starting to use music. So what are we going to cue women into a space of safety and productivity? If we, a lot of the typical correctional practices, and we talk a lot about this in the Resource Center documents we've created, are really cueing women into fear, and they're creating a lot of the problems that they've been designed to not create. So in some ways we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We don't realize that some of the things we're doing are actually causing some problems. So how, again, could we do the business of corrections with these adjustments that really create more safety for her and for us as staff? Environment cues behavior. It's like I'd put it on a bumper sticker if I could. It really absolutely cues behavior. So how I'm even talking to you, if I was talking really, really slow and sounded really, really tired right now, you probably would have all hung up 35 minutes ago. So I'm cueing you right now even as how I'm talking. And if I was live with you, how I'm gesturing and walking and eye contact or not would be cueing you to interest or lack of interest, right? So we can apply that logic to our work with women. So how we respond makes a difference, and what we do can really be about providing stability for her and for us. And so I'll end with, and I'll go through these quickly so there's enough time for questions. And if you're welcome, of course, there'll be a recording of this, but also anything, these I will have less time to cover in detail, but this victim empowerment curriculum that I've referenced at the bottom really goes through dealing with disclosure in detail. This is my kind of summary of it and application to a correction setting. But the basic thing, this was one of the goals of the webinar, to kind of talk about, well, what happens if she does talk about trauma? And we want to be doing these three things: creating safety and security, ventilation and validation, which I'll define, and prediction and preparation. So this safety and security piece is, let's say she tells you about ongoing domestic violence. To provide safety and security sounds like this. What was it like for you to share that with me? Have you had an opportunity to share this with anybody else? And it's really courageous to share something so personal. I admire that. And it can be difficult. You know, it's good for you for having that courage right now. So that creates some safety. What the research shows is that women will give tidbits of what has really happened in their lives as a test to see how we'll react. And they're often minimizing. A lot of folks think they're exaggerating. More often than not, women are minimizing what their experiences have been. And if the staff response doesn't create safety and security, they often recant. They take back what they've said. And sometimes they recant even when we've responded very effectively, because the act of disclosing trauma, especially for the first time, can itself be triggering. So ventilation and validation is this notion of, again, just validating and honoring her experience was real and very painful. And whatever terms she may use, you can repeat back. It sounds like this was really confusing because it involved a half-brother. Wow, it makes sense that you feel that way. That car accident sounds like it did a number on your ability to take care of your kids, and it makes sense that that's frustrating and scary. And this last one around prediction and preparation is critical, because having disclosed, we need to make sure that she's safe. What happens is, in the immediate hours after disclosure, she will often decompensate. It's a fancy word for fall apart in whatever way is unique to her, more depressed, more anxious, more aggressive, more self-harming. So to ask her if she feels safe now, and to ask her if her loved ones are safe. Oftentimes, women are really concerned because they're concerned about, especially if they're incarcerated, they're concerned about children and loved ones who may still live with the very people that abused her. So I worked with a woman who was not showing up to supervisions, and she said, do you think it's easy for me to come here knowing that my mother's watching my kid? She raised me, and look at what happened to me. So there's this thought of, I can't be present to this risk need assessment. I'm worried about my kid with my really angry, aggressive mother. So this notion of loved ones being safe, and these last two are important, to let her know what she can expect might happen given the fact that she's talked to you about this. You might feel nervous. You might feel agitated. And to have a plan with her about being safe given that she might feel a lot of dysregulation and lack of calm and stability having disclosed this to you. And so these do's and don'ts you can review with the PowerPoints copy that you'll receive. And then this in-group disclosure piece, which I'll end with, is just this notion of, if she discloses in group, you obviously are not in a position for a variety of reasons to deal in any extensive way with that disclosure in group. So to just say, that must have really impacted you, it was brave to share it, let me give you some time later so that we can talk about this more outside of group. Instead of saying, we don't do that in group, it's inappropriate, which is going to make her feel horrible and really ashamed, but instead to the H and the E is about honoring what she has said, but also explaining that you find it to be so important, you want to give her some really different time to talk to you about it. And then the L and the P are about the group, right? Everybody who has heard that disclosure is at risk of having their own trauma triggers, etc. So to let the group know, this is courageous, we're here to listen, and we're going to provide you with any supports that you may want or need. And P is about really reinforcing what the plan is in your facility or your agency around confidentiality. You might want to reinforce that with the group, and then again reassure them when you share things that are really significant for you, here's what we do here to make sure we honor that, respect it, and give you some choices about what you want to do with that information. So in conclusion, trauma matters and makes a difference. We've talked about how it impacts women. We also know we need some support for our own personal trauma. There's no one on this planet who hasn't had some form of trauma and stress. We're at risk of burnout, correction stress, vicarious and secondary trauma. So our self-care processes matter. And then, again, women inmates and the support we provide to them makes a difference. And I'd like to end with this very hopeful aspect of the brain research, which is that what we're finding, as I mentioned earlier, is that our rapport, even with a large group of women, how we communicate and the space we create with our body language and our verbal expressive language can actually create stability and creates changes in the brain, which I find extraordinary and so hopeful about the power we have to really facilitate some of us may call it rehabilitation or treatment, but basically to facilitate her own sense of safety, competency, ability, and goal achievement. We actually have much more of an impact on that than I think we realize. And for those of us that are on the front lines in these facilities and agencies doing work day to day, quote unquote, in the trenches with women, treatment, it doesn't just happen in a clinical office. It happens in the day-to-day actions that all of us are a part of with women. And those interactions are literally reshaping brains. When we compliment, focus on strengths, say thank you while holding her accountable, it's literally creating a new sense of neurophysiology. Her nervous system, instead of a memory of trauma, we actually can insert memories of resilience and capacity, which gives us a lot of really amazing power. So we have an innate capacity to heal, and I look forward to your questions either now or my contact information. You're welcome to contact me anytime with some of the raw examples of this work or successes or any additional information that you might find helpful. So I'll turn it over to Stephen now.
Okay. Thanks so much, Alyssa. Very helpful information, and we do have some questions in the queue. Before we get to the questions, I do want to go over the information we have here. So as Alyssa said, if you do have questions or you want some of the resources she talked about, or just to ask questions, her contact information is here. Our contact information, the National Resource Center on Justice Involved Women. Becky Ney is the project director, and if you'd like to get on our email list, we have that information there. The American Jail Association's information is there. If you are interested in any future webinars or other events, their conference is coming up next month, so if you haven't already registered, I think there's still time. The SAMHSA National Center for Trauma-Informed Care, again, they're one of our partners, and they have a lot of helpful information. Next slide. This is one of the briefs that we talked about throughout this presentation. This is the one that Alyssa wrote on using trauma-informed practices. I really encourage you, excuse me, to download it and read it when you have a few moments. And this is the Discipline and Sanctions Policy Guide. Alyssa, did you want to talk about this resource at all?
I just encourage folks to take a look at it because it really just focuses on how to create an institutional culture, including discipline and sanctions that attends to trauma and gender.
Okay, great. And then SAMHSA has two really great resources. They promote trauma-informed care practices, and I think that what they've put out so far in this Creating a Trauma-Informed Criminal Justice System for Women publication is fantastic. The next slide, we have another, the concept of trauma and guidance for a trauma-informed approach. Again, two really good resources. Not only are they available on the SAMHSA website, but they're also available on our National Resource Center on Justice Involved Women's website. So I'm going to just open the questions. We do have a couple that are in the queue, and the first question that we got a little earlier today was about what happens when substance abuse is involved with regard to trauma.
Mm-hmm. Well, we know from certainly our interactions with women and the research on trauma and substance abuse is that there's an intersection between mental health, substance abuse, and trauma, and so they often co-occur. And I think I mentioned earlier, and I'm not sure if this is answering the question, that the substance abuse itself is often linked to the desire to be free from the distress that women are experiencing in the wake of trauma. This distress is often, again, we think of it as, oh, it's in moments or days or weeks after traumatic experiences, but it often goes on for months and years. And so the substance abuse is her best effort to be free from that distress, and we all know that it has, it's a short-term gain and a long-term loss because addiction is devastating on her life and in the lives of those around her in many ways. And then what we find too is there's a mental health overlay. Some of the long-term substance abuse creates mental health issues, or unmet mental health needs can also lead to substance use. So they're some of the best curricula out there and assessments don't treat mental health, substance abuse, and trauma separately, but rather speak about them holistically because they hang together in most cases. So you feel free to refine your question if there's something more specific you'd like for me to speak to.
Okay. Our next question is about, I'm sorry. Can you repeat the name of the evidence-based model being used for probation and parole? And I believe that was the TICP model that you talked about earlier.
It's the Woman Offender Case Management Model, affectionately called WOCM, and I believe it's on the Resource Center website, some descriptions of it. But even if you Google Woman Offender Case Management Model, it was developed by Orbis, which is one of the Resource Center partners, through partnership with National Institute of Corrections. And I had the honor of being able to participate in the training of the 4 pilot sites, the 4 different states that piloted this model, Connecticut, where I live, being one of them. And it's the results are pretty impressive. And it's when you take the time to look at the rationale, the underlying philosophy of the model, it's exactly in line with what we talked about in this webinar, and is a pretty beautiful example of how to be gender and trauma informed as part of probation and parole. And in some states, they start in the facility, and then there's a team of individuals that work with her as she exits the facility and moves into parole, or there is a state that does it just as part of probation. So there's very creative ways you can implement it in your different states.
Okay, thank you. So this next question is a two-parter in a way. What can happen when staff traumas are not treated? Also, how does that trigger inmate trauma? So I'm going to ask that first question, and then we'll go to the second part of the question.
So I love that question, and it gets at something that is this related but very important topic around staff having an opportunity to deal with their own life stressors and trauma so that they can be available for the work. So what happens is if we haven't had an opportunity to develop even some of our own regulation skills, the skills that help us stay out of a fight response and a flight response, and instead of an unconscious reaction, we really want to move into a place of a conscious awareness of what's happening right now, where am I at, where am I triggered, how can I create some calm so that as I speak and act, I'm being effective. If we don't have an opportunity to do that and develop those skills, the answer to what happens is we absolutely, at minimum, we're ineffective, and at maximum, we're actively triggering women and ourselves at the same time. So I was in a facility where there was a refusal to transition from one part of the facility to the next. And at the staff, I could tell, we processed this after, and it was really, I so appreciated the staff members' honest account of what they were going through in the moment, but they were upset. This person had been defying over and over again staff directives, and so then the staff member starts to yell, woman starts to get very upset, she starts to kick a wall. That was frightening for the staff member, because what he disclosed to me after was that that's one of his caregivers was violent in the home. So as she starts to kick the wall, he starts to escalate, and he loses a sense of his own ground and now starts yelling at her more, and she starts kicking the wall harder. So the whole thing started to become, it's like pouring gasoline on the fire. And I think that it's, as I said, it's very unconscious for women. Sometimes they're reacting from that low road to fear, where there's not there's not the active thinking process. We are just as at risk of that, and so especially in our work in corrections. So to have an opportunity to process our own traumas, but at minimum to say, okay, how do I know when I'm getting agitated, and what are 3 things I can do to create some calm in the moment, so that I'm operating from a more neutral place, not one that's got all my own stuff. When all our own stuff and our fears and our concerns about our own stuff in the past is at play, we can't possibly be attentive to her. So it absolutely triggers women when we can't kind of hold our own seat. What's the part 2, Stephen?
The part 2 is it's a little broader. It just says how does the fear, I'm sorry, let me just see if I can get this. Trauma has been created by fear, and we have created an environment of fear in the U.S., fear of others, fear of different languages, fear of differences of any kind. How does that play a role in justice systems for both practitioners and women in the system?
That's another fabulous question. It plays a role in that all it does is deepen those grooves in the brain that are wired to respond in a way that's about immediate survival. So the culture of fear that we're all exposed to, I mean, they even did studies in the wake of 9/11 around the repeated exposure to the images of 9/11 in the media. It was on 24 hours a day, multiple days a week, for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so that's just one aspect of our culture that was terrifying, right? And so what happens is we are all operating on some level in a defensive posture, right? There's a lot of elements of the world that are scary, but also I think the media and other factors do create a kind of a culture of fear and distrust. And so we enter, for instance, if you work in a jail, you're already entering your shift with a degree of self-protection and vigilance. Now you have your training as a corrections officer, and you've been trained to have either an additional layer of vigilance around this particular work setting. So now you're dealing with at least 2 layers of vigilance driven by fear and self-protection. And so that absolutely has a bearing on how we are going to view women, view the work, view what's helpful. And again, it goes back to what I said in response to the other question. We've got to give ourselves the gift of time to develop skills and practices that will help us be truly present on the job to attend to what she needs in the moment, and not have this backpack we're carrying all the time of other fears and concerns and worries, because they become interruptions to the process. So but I like how the question was phrased, and I think the question itself is an education for all of us. It's a reminder. This is the larger climate in the U.S. right now is has a lot of fear in it. And so I really have to deal with my own reactions to that before I step into my work with women. And what I would say, kind of to summarize, is if we're not regulated, we don't have a prayer of helping her to develop regulation. That's just, I mean, it's logical, right? So
Right.
is there another question, Stephen?
We have a couple of other questions, but we only have a minute before we close down. If we can answer this one very quickly, let's see. As a mandated reporter, how do you not break the sense of trust and safety after a woman discloses something that they do not want to report or want us to report? That's a really good question, I
Yes.
thought.
Yes, and one of the keys to that is to make sure that you are crystal clear up front with her when you first meet her about what the policies are around disclosure and mandated reporting. And so what happens often is we don't necessarily do a good job of that front-end conversation about process, so then months or weeks later she discloses and she's totally surprised by the fact that we have to report. So to have conversations up front, and then even despite that, she might be very upset and be reminded of that policy. And so I would use those 3 essential skills that I reviewed earlier to move through that conversation and assure her about what the rationale is, validate her concerns about it, and collaborate with her on, given that you have to report, how can you move through that in a way that's minimizing her distress? How can she be involved within policy? How can you move through it and give her choices while still adhering to your requirement to report?
Okay. Thank you so much, Alyssa. We have several questions in the queue, and what I may try to do is get some of those answers, put like a Q&A questions we were unable to answer live on our website. The PowerPoint presentation and recording will be on our website. Can you put up the last slide, please?
Sure.
And so that's going to be available. Here's our web address. We'll also have Alyssa's bio available for someone who did ask that question. And when these materials are available on both AJA's website and in our CJIW's website, you can print them out for yourself for the individual who did ask about that. We would like to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. We know that your job can be incredibly challenging at times, and we hope that we've provided you with some strategies and resources that we think will be helpful. Excuse me. I'd like to thank our presenter, Alyssa Benedict, for sharing interesting and very targeted, I think, information. Alyssa, do you have any closing remarks you'd like to make?
No, the only thing I'd like to say in closing is that I wish I could see everyone's faces as I say this, but I so appreciate the work that you all are doing in a very difficult environment with people who are suffering, and I look forward to supporting you in any way that I can through resources or conversations or emails as we try to transform our systems together.
Wonderful. And on behalf of the National Resource Center on Justice Involved Women, I would like to thank AJ President Jamie Clayton and Executive Director Bob Kasabian. It's been such a pleasure partnering with them over the past few years on this and many other endeavors, and so it's a partnership that we've benefited from greatly, and we appreciated the time today to access his audience. Thanks also to Patty Vermillion and Connie Lacey for their support today. Thanks again for your participation. We appreciate it, and have a great day. Goodbye, everybody.